Very good morning to all of you. So, in this segment, we would be discussing how slavery was abolished in France, right? And this very concept of slavery as we know it today was sort of introduced in modern Europe. And we will see as to why it was introduced, how did it get abolished in France, particularly. We are not going to be dealing with the other nations and what is generally the story behind slavery, right, per se. Right now, when we talk about the abolition of slavery, right, the banning of slavery, so to speak, it was one of the reforms that was undertaken by the Jacobin government, right, under Maximilian Robespierre. Right, he was the one who decided that slavery should not exist, and he basically banned slavery in all the French colonies. Right, you understand what colonies are, right? Like for instance, India was a colony of Britain, Singapore was a colony of Britain, Hong Kong was also a British colony. So you get the point, right? When they went and illegally occupied other lands for the sake of looting and plundering, basically, and they called it trade. Right. So over here, Jacobin government decides that we need to abolish slavery, right? And this was one of the major reforms they had undertaken, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of explain a little bit of a story to you, right? The notes are there on Veracross in any case, so you can always refer to it. All those notes have been uploaded, right? But it is important to understand the context behind what we are discussing. अच्छा, तो अगर मैं if I'm going to discuss slavery in the French context, we are going to be looking at a very specific area, right? We are going to be looking at something called the Caribbean. All right. Now, Caribbean is a group of islands in the western part of the world. ठीक है. अब इसमें से some islands were occupied by the British, like Jamaica, for instance, right, from where Usain Bolt is. Other name, of course, the cricket fans would know this better. The West Indies, it's otherwise also known as this group of islands, right? Now, amongst this, there is a certain number of islands that have been occupied by France. ठीक है. अब इसमें से 3 island हैं particularly which have been occupied by France and which are of interest to us. Now these 3 islands that I am talking about, one, two, three, these are the Martinique Islands, the Guadeloupe Islands, and the San Domingo Islands. Right, so 3 islands, right? Martinique, Guadeloupe, and San Domingo. Right, now the big idea behind these islands is that they are important suppliers of the four most important commodities in European markets at that point of time, and that is sugar, super expensive, tobacco, indigo, super expensive again, and coffee. Of course, it is still expensive, right? So four products, right? So these 3 islands were French colonies, and they supplied these four products to France. Acha. Now the situation is, you need to understand that in these islands, all right, in these islands were producing these four products, and these four products were sort of cultivated in plantations. Right, you understand what a plantation is, right? Coffee plantation, rubber plantation, spice plantation, right? Basically, large farms. Now, these plantations were owned by Europeans. ठीक है. These plantations were owned by Europeans, and what these European masters wanted, owners wanted, they wanted to hire European labor. ठीक है. They wanted to hire European labor to work on these plantations. Pretty simple, right? Now the problem is that this European labor is a bit hesitant. Okay, this European labor is a bit hesitant because, to be very honest, nobody wants to go that far away from home, all the way from Europe to West Indies. Right, nobody wants to go that far to work on plantations, right? तो अगर यूरोपियन लेबर को इतना हेजिटेशन है, सो दे आर नॉट कमिंग टू द वेस्ट इंडीज, विच इज लीडिंग टू अ लेबर शॉर्टेज. आर यू एबल टू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट इज हैपनिंग, राइट? ये लोग नहीं आ रहे हैं तो लेबर का शॉर्टेज हो रहा है. वेरी सिंपल, राइट? प्रीटी इजी टू अंडरस्टैंड. सो आई हैव रिटन ओवर हियर आल्सो, राइट, that the Europeans were hesitant to leave Europe and work in such distant lands, and thus it led to shortage of labor. अच्छा, अभी कहीं ना कहीं से तो लेबर का रिक्वायरमेंट यू नीड टू फुलफिल, राइट, बिकॉज मैजिकली क्रॉप्स आर नॉट गोइंग टू ग्रो, दिस इज नॉट हॉगवर्ड्स, राइट. So now, in order to fulfill the demand for labor, a very sinister, a very evil, a very diabolical sort of a slave trade, right, emerges between three continents. ठीक है, continent number one, of course, is Europe. And in this case, I am not going to take the entire Europe. I am just going to take the example of France because it is relevant to our discussion. France. Then right over here we have the wonderful continent of Africa. Not the best diagram, please forgive me. ठीक है, this is Africa. And then these are the Americas over here. I am including the United States of America. I am including the Indies, the West Indies, which falls in between, and of course Southern America over here as well, like Latin America. Right. So you need to understand now how this trade worked. ठीक है. Now during the 18th century, all right, during the 18th century, France emerged as a major player in the global slave trade, all right. And particularly, two major cities in France emerged as the hub of slave trade. The first city is a port city, the name of which is Bordeaux. It's a French city, it's a beautiful place, very famous for its red wines. And then the second city, of course, is a city called Nantes. Again, famous city, famous for its cheese, but at that point of time, also famous for its slave trade, right? So Bordeaux and Nantes emerged as the hub of slave trade in France. Now look how this thing worked, all right. It's a pretty simple explanation. अच्छा, यूरोप और यूएसए के बीच में अटलांटिक ओशन आता है जहां पे टाइटैनिक डूब गई थी. ठीक है, जनरल नॉलेज. इनके बीच में अटलांटिक ओशन आता है. ठीक है, काफी बड़ा ओशन है, लंबा चौड़ा ओशन है. ठीक है, इट्स ह्यूज, राइट. नाउ लेट अस सी हाउ दिस जर्नी वर्क्स. नाउ these French merchants or plantation workers who wanted slaves, they used to start from Bordeaux and Nantes by ship. They used to first go all the way to Africa. ठीक है, step number one. They used to go all the way to Africa, where the local chiefs in Africa, local rulers, local kings, you get local businessmen, whatever, right? They used to supply these plantation workers with slaves. Am I very clear? ठीक है. Now once they used to purchase those slaves from these local chiefs, they used to put them back on ships in an extremely inhumane manner. They used to literally stuff them inside ships, and they used to begin the second half of their journey, wherein 3 महीने का जर्नी फ्रॉम द अफ्रीकन कोस्ट ऑल द वे टू द कैरेबियन, ऑल द वे टू द यूनाइटेड स्टेट्स एंड ऑल द वे टू द लैटिन अमेरिका. फिलहाल हमें वेस्ट इंडीज से मतलब है. वी आर इंटरेस्टेड इन द कैरेबियन. सो दिस इज अ 3 month लॉन्ग जर्नी फ्रॉम अफ्रीका टू द कैरेबियन. ठीक है, फ्रॉम अफ्रीका टू कैरेबियन by ship. Obviously there is no jet airways or Indigo airlines. ठीक है. So now once they reach the West Indies, once they reach the Caribbean, right, once they reach the Caribbean, the slaves are deboarded, right, they are deboarded and they are taken to a slave market, right, where they are purchased by the local plantation owners, right, where they are purchased by local plantation owners. So in a sense, if I say slaves were considered to be the personal property, right, if I say that slaves were considered to be the personal property of plantation owners, I don't think I would be saying anything wrong, right? So slaves were considered to be the personal property of plantation owners just because of this thing. So they used to pay money and go to the slave market to purchase slaves. You can see how horrendous it is. राइट नाउ ये जब शुरू हुआ तो स्लेवरी वॉज बेयरली क्रिटिसाइज्ड इन फ्रांस लाइक पीपल अपेरेंटली डिड नॉट हैव एनी प्रॉब्लम विद इट स्पेशली द ट्रेडर्स एंड द बिजनेसमैन ऑब्वियसली राइट ठीक है. And the National Assembly, which existed at that point of time, if you remember, by the Constitution of 1791, right? The National Assembly, which existed at that point of time, had held huge debates. कि ये जो Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen है, this very very important document in the Constitution itself, French Constitution, should it technically be applied to all men or not? Because slaves are also men, slaves are also human beings, right? But then they eventually decided that no, we can't take the risk of giving slaves fundamental rights because we don't want to make the French traders and businessmen angry. The entire motive is extremely selfish, as you can see. Okay, so they refuse to give any rights to the slaves. Fair enough. ठीक है. तो इवेंचुअली क्या हुआ जब 1794 में रेन ऑफ टेरर राइट 1794 में द कन्वेंशन passes a law finally and the convention declares slavery to be illegal. ठीक है. Convention passes a law in 1794 which declares slavery to be illegal, but the problem is that this is a very short term measure. ठीक है. I will explain why is it a short term measure. It is a short term measure because 10 years later, ठीक है, 10 years later there is another guy who comes. You all know him very well. You have all heard of him. He is none other than Napoleon Bonaparte. ठीक है. Napoleon Bonaparte comes once again and he makes slavery legal, right? He brings back slavery. ठीक है. He brings back slavery. Are you able to understand? Right. So this is a huge issue. But eventually, way after Napoleon's death, way after anything else, in 1840, sorry, in 18, okay, in 1848, slavery is finally abolished in France for good. Yeah, this is when slavery is finally abolished in France for good. So this was the general understanding of slavery, its context, particularly, of course, pertaining to France, right? In the context of France, how it worked, who were the major people involved, players involved, and so on and so forth. I hope this made sense. Please do reach out to me in case of any queries. The notes are already there on Where Across should you wish to have a look. And yeah, that's it. Thank you and have a great day ahead. Bye bye.